anxiety is an issue of the physiology of the body from old unresolved wounds than it is the psychology of the mind. I think through interoception, I think the mind is constantly reading the body. If you had some sort of trauma that's not resolved, that you couldn't talk about, that you couldn't share with someone, it builds up inside of you. And then your mind just reflects that. And we worship the mind so much in our society. We believe that the mind is the cause of anxiety. And the mind is the expression. Like, we talk to ourselves in words, we talk to ourselves in language, but if you look at the structure of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the subcortical structures, none of those subcortical structures understand language. They're all feeling based. And that's where a lot of these programs get put into us as younger people. So anxiety is much more of a feeling disorder than it is a thinking disorder.
All right, my friend, Mr. Russ, Mr. Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy.
How you doing, Connor?
It's good to have you here. We go way back.
Vancouver.
And it's been really, really cool to see your work around anxiety, which you've been doing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to say, I knew you before you blew up. I knew you before you hit it big.
Right.
I knew you before, it was interesting because I remember talking with you. This has got to be like 6 years ago around anxiety. And I was like, man, this is such a topical thing. And your approach is so unique. And I kind of had this notion of like, this is going to do really well. People really, and it's going to do really well because it's serving so many people who are just immersed, in sort of like an anxious soup on a daily basis for multiple reasons. And so I'm excited to talk about this topic of anxiety. So let's begin with your defining moment. So tell us a story about a defining moment in your life that made you who you are today.
Yeah, I think there's a few. I mean, I think when you first asked me that, it's like, I think my father's suicide was probably a real defining moment, because it was... There was such a conflict around that, because he had been suffering with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder for, 15, 20 years before that. And his suicide was kind of a relief, but it was also, a real sadness in me too, because the thing about my dad is, yes, he could be bipolar and crazy and psychotic, but he could also be very loving, warm, attentive, playful. So, but he got less of those things as his disease progressed, as he got older. So his suicide, and I found his body, it was like, and my brother was there too. And I just said, well, that's it for Dad. Right. Mm-hmm. And even when I say that now, there's this sort of rush in my chest. It's like, how did I process that at the time? Like, I was trying to get into medical school and that kind of thing. And then I found I got into medical school 5 months later. I got the letter saying you were admitted to medical school. And I so badly wanted to show him that letter, and he wasn't around anymore for that. But I also realized that his suffering was over, because he really suffered so much. I mean, we suffered with his family too. So that was one real defining moment in my life. And probably one of the reasons I'm a caregiver and a doctor is because I could never really help my dad. So that was one. The next one was in 2013 when I ruptured my left Achilles tendon, because, like the arrogant doctor that I was, I injected myself with cortisone and lidocaine because it worked once. It's like the longest yard when they throw the ball in the other guy's nuts. It's like, work once, should work again. So I injected my left Achilles tendon and it ruptured. And then that was the straw that broke the doctor's back. So in 2013, I left medicine and started really doing this anxiety thing full time, because I was just so tired of living every day in a 10-hour panic attack. And I thought, I've got to find a different way. And that's when I did psychedelics and looked at different ways of healing my anxiety. Went to India, lived at a temple there for a while. Just every possible angle that you could think of attacking anxiety, I did. And then I wrote about it in the book. So it really gives people a firsthand knowledge of, I know how you feel. I know what it's like to be suicidal with anxiety. And that's when I ruptured my Achilles tendon. I was thinking, am I going to follow the same path as my dad?
How old were you when he took his own life?
I was 26 and he was 52.
52.
Yeah.
Huh. So he was a young father to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, I think he had me when he was 25.
Yeah. Yeah. So, interesting. And I mean, maybe just say a little bit more about what that was like for you, because I can hear the the complexity of it, right? You can see, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, even if their circumstances are different. But I think a lot of people can relate to seeing a parent who's suffering, who's struggling, and whether it's with some type of cancer or some disease, and there's this notion of like, well, you don't want to lose them, and you also don't want them to suffer. And so can you just talk a little bit about what it was like to deal with the complexity of that loss, where I would imagine you probably missed having him around, but at the same time it was like, well, at least he's not in pain anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And he was also causing a lot of disruption to the family too. And I laugh about it because it's kind of like my defense mechanism. But, he would shoplift like crazy. Like my little joke, we have this store in Canada called Eaton's. We used to have this department store. And when he died, I went through his closet. He had all these belts and like 5 of the same belt. Like it was just, it was a sport for him. So my joke was that he single-handedly put Eaton's out of business. So there was a lot of pain around, his behavior as well, and embarrassment and that kind of thing too. So it was difficult for us as a family to be able to really, and I think there's a lot of shame around it too. And I think another one of the reasons I became a doctor was to kind of, in a way, kind of erase the embarrassing parts of his life in a way. Now I'm kind of over that now, whatever over that means. But there was this sort of sense of atonement, and on some level the book is that way too, because the book wouldn't have been written if I didn't have a father who suffered so badly with mental, emotional illness. The other thing too was that it was gradual, So when I was 10 years old, he would have a period where he would be either manic or depressed or whatever for a month, And then say when I was 17 or 18, it would be like 2 or 3 months. And when I was 24 or 25, it would be like half the year. So it just became, and schizophrenia is like that. It tends to get worse as you get older. Not always. Whereas bipolars can kind of stay, within that sort of up and down realm, but schizophrenia tends to get worse as you get older. So there was embarrassment. You're right. There was so many complex emotions, and there still is. And I think a lot of my anxiety was, am I going to turn out like him? That was probably the main reason why I got anxious. And I talked to, the men in my practice and that kind of stuff too, who have a father who's, impaired in some way, either addicted or a mental illness or the sufferer of abuse or whatever. The men tell me like, it's really hard to trust that this male figure, this dominant figure in your life is there for you, because often the addiction will take them away. And I think the mental illness took my dad away from me. So it was this sense that, okay, I can't trust love, because whenever I loved my dad, he would go, nuts, and I would lose him on some level. So that was a big thing. And there is only love and fear. So, this is Dr. Kennedy get into a bit of the philosophical thing. So if you can't trust love, your life's going to get filled up with fear. That's what's going to happen. And that's what happened with me. So I was really deathly afraid. And I used to tell myself, okay, you make it to 25. Most schizophrenia will show up by 25. So you're okay. So I made it 25. I was okay. And then I made it 30. I was just finishing med school at 30. I started a little bit late. And I still wasn't. And I thought, man, if you can finish med school and you haven't gone psychotic yet, you're probably not going to. But it took until about 35. And once I was 35, it's like, okay, I'm probably not going to get that. But instead, I developed an anxiety disorder. And I think a lot of what I see in anxiety in men is covering up something else. Like they're A, not really aware that what they have is anxiety. And then B, they don't really know what to do with it, because it has been sort of a solve, or at least a layer of the onion that prevents them from feeling that deep grief, that deep loss. So, I see that much more in men. Women are much more open to talk about what makes them anxious. Men are they kind of just think it's going to go away. And it does. I mean, there is this diurnal, if you look at neurochemistry, like there is this diurnal or varied chemistry in our brain, where at points we'll feel horrible and at other points we'll feel good. And I think that what happens is that you sort of, you focus on the points where you feel good. And then with the points you feel bad, men typically will start, some kind of addiction. I read your book. It's amazing. I love your book. Porn, alcohol, anything. And then basically your respect for yourself drops. And then this whole cascade of things where you take out the underpinnings of what keeps you safe, and you do it yourself. And then there's the self-reproach of that, and this little acronym that I have called JABS. When you judge, abandon, blame, and shame yourself, you'll never get out of that loop. Unless you become aware of it, which is another thing I really loved about your book, was just the awareness around it. Like, this is normal. It's normal not to want to be vulnerable, because, when you get vulnerable, you get smacked down sometimes. And that can be, Dan Siegel talks about that. The most vulnerable time is for your brain is like when you're being vulnerable and then someone smacks you down. That's the most vulnerable period that you could possibly be in. So that's where our intimate relationships, suffer, because we want to be vulnerable. We want to be open with our partners. But if they don't take it well, which, as you point out in your book, quite accurately, sometimes they don't. There is this saying, like, the women's like, well, why don't you be more vulnerable? Why don't you be? And then you are, and then you get your pee-pee smacked, So it's just like, So it's this conundrum that you point out quite aptly in the book, is that, there's this vulnerability, and we need to express this stuff, or else it just rots us from the inside. Or we're finding a way to kind of heal ourselves and connect with ourselves. And I think that's my, theory of anxiety, is that it's your younger self that's basically in your body, that's resonating through your mind. And if you can find that younger version of you and see them, hear them, love them, and show them they're protected and you'll always be with them, then you take away the alarm, and the alarm is what's feed the anxiety. So then things kind of, you have at least a shot at healing when you do it that way.
One of the things that you said in there, and there's many things that stood out to me, but one of the things that really anchored in is the statement, when you can't trust love, fear takes over. And that hit me. I mean, I think that was just sort of profound, in the sense that when I think about most spiritual traditions, therapeutic traditions, they're all kind of saying some version of that, right? Some iteration of when you can't trust love, or if you don't trust love, or if love is scary, or if it's the thing that you don't want to go near, or it's the thing that you think has hurt you or you're wounded by, then fear is what takes over. And I see that to be so true for so many people. So I just wanted to pause and earmark that, because I could hear my listeners being like, "Oh, that's a line right there, man! Yeah. That's a T-shirt." But I want to pivot, because I think what in some ways what you were talking about with when you can't trust love, fear takes over. It sounds very true for your story and your life, and I appreciate you being very honest and forthcoming about your experience and some of the things that surrounded your relationship with your father, because they're complex. Our relationships with our parents are complex, and it does sound like, in part, that anxiety, you're unearthing that anxiety was coming from things that maybe you weren't letting yourself feel. And I know for myself, there's been times in my life where I felt that anxiety, and what was underneath that was I needed to cry, or I needed to let some rage out, I needed to go outside of my garage and just let loose on the punching bag, because I was storing in something. And it's like, well, what's this anxiety? It's like, well, actually, it's a manifestation of something that's deeper that needs to emerge. So am I articulating what you've been saying accurately?
Yeah. And when you were talking, it was like one of the things that I used to do. I don't do so much anymore, but is car screaming. We used to live in Vancouver, so I would drive through, Kitsilano, go to the park there and just car scream. It just gets it out. The other thing that I do sometimes is I watch YouTube videos of dogs being rescued. And that puts me into tears every time, because I know that there's part of me that has to let that out. Because if I don't let it out, it's just going to rot me from the inside. And what it does is it just starts feeding your thoughts. It just feeds these negative thoughts. And your mind will create thoughts that are completely consistent with how your body feels. So if your body is feeling upset, stressed, angry, whatever, your mind, which is just a make sense, meaning-making machine, will take that through this process that Dr. Stephen Porges calls interoception, where the mind is constantly reading the body. it's very difficult to think in opposition to how your body feels. There is this sort of positive psychology thing, which works in, for the first 1.6 seconds, it actually works. And as long as you keep it up, you can sort of maintain the facade. But really, what you're trying to do to heal is go in and find that younger version of yourself and see them, hear them, love them, show them they're protected. And that's the source of, I think, just about all mental illness, emotion, depression, eating disorders, OCD, is this sense that we weren't connected enough as children. And sometimes your parents were okay, but you were just born a sensitive child. And I think that boys are born more sensitive than girls. I just think that that's our nature. We die earlier, we get sick earlier. 102 girls are born, or 102 boys are born for every 100 girls, just the way nature makes it. And then by the age of 18, 2 of those boys have, jumped off a cliff or, got into a car or whatever. So it evens out at 18. And then from 18 on, women outnumber men.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that stands out for me in terms of what you're saying, and I do think that there's research around this. I can't cite it or quote it off the top of my head, but I do remember hearing somewhere that men feel more intensely and women feel a wider gamut. And so I think that is, from my work in working with men and working with couples with my wife and working with women, that does seem to be on average true. I would say that it's, I would say that it's largely true that men seem to feel much more deeply and intensely. Maybe not deeply is not the right word, but intensely. Yeah. And then women tend to sort of cycle through a wider gamut of emotions in a specific hour or day or week. So let's pivot a little bit to anxiety. Let's go straight at the beast.
Sure.
What would you say are the most common myths about anxiety? Because I see a lot of content about it, and some of it I'm like, this is nonsense. But what are some of the myths that you see floating around out there?
Yeah, that it's an issue of the mind. I think that anxiety is much more an issue of the physiology of the body from old unresolved wounds than it is the psychology of the mind. I think through interoception, I think the mind is constantly reading the body. And if you had, an abusive father, an alcoholic father, if you had some sort of trauma that's not resolved, that you couldn't talk about, that you couldn't share with someone, it builds up inside of you. And if you don't have a way of allowing that to go, it will build up more and more in your body. And then your mind just reflects that. And we worship the mind so much in our society. We believe that the mind is the cause of anxiety. And the mind is the expression. Like, we talk to ourselves in words, we talk to ourselves in language. But if you look at the structure of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the subcortical structures like the amygdala, the pons, the medulla, brainstem, none of those subcortical structures understand language. They're all feeling based. And that's where a lot of these programs get put into us as boys, as younger people and girls. And we're not going to access those just using the conscious cognitive parts of our mind. So we have to change the body as well. So anxiety is much more of a feeling disorder than it is a thinking disorder. Now, of course, the mind plays a huge role in it, but we worship the mind in this society. We're much more adept at, if I say, Connor, describe an apple to me, you can tell, well, it's sort of semi-round, it's kind of red, it's this. But if I say, how do you feel when you bite into an apple? That's a lot harder for us to kind of conjure up. So we're much more, emotionally versed in language than we are in the actual emotion itself. So we get used to explaining things. And coming back to what you were saying before about women, the more vocabulary, emotional vocabulary you have, the more able you are to diffuse that emotion. Men typically don't have that emotional vocabulary. And if we can't explain, like, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling lost, I'm feeling alone, I'm feeling hollow, like that, those are all kind of female centric terms, man, it's like, I feel frustrated, I'm angry, we have like, 4 words where women have 14. And Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her book, How Emotions Are Made, talks about this. The more emotion words you have, the more emotionally literate you are. Now, I don't know if it's chicken or the egg, But I always thought a great app would be, just every day looking at a new emotion word and trying to bring it in, because there are nuances in emotion that men don't tend to see. And I think we're wired that way. I just think we're wired to look at things more than we are to look at people. And I think women look more at people than they do at things.
I would agree with that entirely. What would you say if I asked you what the purpose of anxiety is?
I think it's just to point you towards your younger self. To point you towards your younger wounded self. I mean, it's the same thing with OCD, same thing with eating disorders. It's the same thing with depression. It just points you to your younger self. All these things express differently, like OCD is different than depression. But basically the underlying root cause is usually childhood emotional trauma that's unresolved. I did a lot of work with Gordon Neufeld over at the Neufeld Institute there in Vancouver. And it's really, 80% of your brain development's before the age of 5. So if you have a healthy, attached, attuned parent or caregiver, your brain structures are going to develop in the best way. Now, if you have parents who are traumatized themselves or not attached to you, and parental mismatch is a huge issue with people. Their parents were okay, but they always just felt like, I didn't really feel like my mother understood me or whatever. And Nicole LePera talks about that too, like this emotional parental mismatch. And that's traumatic for a child. And I sometimes I want to have a seizure talking about trauma because it's such a common word that's used. But trauma to me is anything that dysregulates your nervous system permanently. So anything that causes a permanent dysregulation in your nervous system is trauma. And I think we're all traumatized as children. But if you have a connected, attuned, attached parent that helps you process it, you actually become emotionally stronger with the trauma after you've dealt with it because you've had this help, rather than just stuffing it down, rather than just not dealing with it or having a life that's, not difficult at all. Because we all have trauma. It's just, did we have caregivers? Did we have people that help us metabolize that trauma? And if you do, then your brain learns, hey, we can go through some shitty things, but we can handle it. Whereas if you go through trauma and you don't have that, you learn that trauma is an endless cycle of pain that you will recreate upon yourself as well. Like if you feel traumatized in your body, you will traumatize yourself in your mind. You will judge, abandon, blame, and shame yourself. And that inner child part of you constantly does that to you. And you can't heal. It's like having a scab and you just keep picking the scab over and over and over again. Like you just can't heal while you keep judging, abandoning, blaming, and shaming yourself.
It's interesting because I think the way you're describing the purpose of anxiety, there's two things I want to say. One, I've heard some of my audience, just people in general, the notion, because there's a lot of people that say, everybody has trauma, right? Gabor Mate said that and whatnot. And I think that's hard for some people to really let in, this notion that everybody's had trauma, everybody's had traumatic events, because I think historically we've looked at trauma as a car accident, this big sort of acute thing, which I think our definition of trauma has expanded, of course. But how do you talk to people who are like, not everybody has trauma. Like I don't have trauma. I haven't had trauma. What would you say to those folks who hear that and are just like, man, I can't get on board with that. Like that just sounds dramatic.
Well, it's sometimes like if I'm talking to a more sort of, shall we say, philosophical audience, I will use the term inner child sometimes. I tend to shy away from it. And then I'll often use your younger self, because that's usually when I talk to doctors or I talk to sort of professionals, that's something they'll understand. But the people I find that object the most to the inner child statement are the ones with the most inner child wounding.
Okay,
so it's funny.
Fair.
It's like that inner child stuff, it's just a bunch of crap. And it's like, okay, what happened to you? Yeah. Right? Like it's just the people that had like, a fairly normal, whatever that is, upbringing with attuned, they weren't perfect parents, but they were attached. They hear the term inner child and doesn't even faze them. right?
Yeah.
That's what I've noticed. But the people that get the most upset about the inner child stuff are the ones that have the most inner child wounding. So it's just an observation, over dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people with anxiety. So I think it's just understanding that the charge behind, even, if you have a lot of charge behind that term, there's something there. Like you say in your book, like there's something there, and you've got to sort of look into that. Now, often we don't have enough insight in our own selves because we do have blind spots for our own traumas. It's just the way the human neurology is wired. So if you grow up with an alcoholic parent who's abusive, you learn to excuse that behavior. And this is why, like Freud called it the repetition compulsion. This is why I would have patients in my practice. One particular woman in particular that I talk about a fair amount on podcasts she was a beautiful girl and had all this attention from men, but the only men that she would pick to be partners were abusive alcoholics. Her father was an abusive she had a huge blind spot, and yet she was most attracted to these people. So like Freud called it the repetition compulsion, the compulsion to act out in your childhood, in your adulthood, what was in your childhood. And it's unconscious. It's automatic. It's sometimes, this is when I say, when some of my friends, this is when I was younger, would say, I met this girl, she's amazing. She's like just perfect. It's like, okay, now this is one of those cases where your soulmate is going to become your cellmate, because what happens is that each of you are lighting up the trauma from your childhood and some of the most intense relationships. And, I've read your book. I know that you've had a history with a number of females in the past. The most intense relationships are the ones that are often, you're lighting each other up from the past. Mm-hmm. So
trauma bonds.
Trauma bonds. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and it's interesting because my mentor, Dewey Freeman, I love him, and he's got a very profound model of attachment. And one of the things that he says is that the foundation of a relationship is being able to go through a hard time and come out the other side okay. Plain and simple, right? You're a kid, you fall off your bike, you scrape your knee, you go through a hard time, you come out the other side okay, right? Your parent comforts you, they're like, you're okay. If you go through that hard time and your dad comes out and says, what the fuck is wrong with you? Stop being a little bitch and stop crying, which is harsh, but some of us hear that, right?
Yes,
I heard some stuff
your
like that.
Your stepdad, yeah.
Right? And so what happens is that what we learn is it's not okay for me to go through a hard time, or I have to go through a hard time and be okay on my own. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is very, creates isolation, and we psychologically move to a more insular place. But done over time, that is traumatic, right? Whether it's acute in that moment or over time. And so I think, one of the things that I appreciate about what you're saying, to just sort of close this loop on this, and then we'll come back to anxiety, is we have to be able to look back at our past. Because I hear a lot of men and some women say, why do I have to talk about my past? Why do I have to talk about my family? Why do I have to talk about my upbringing? And I'm like, well, those are the places where you learn the foundation of, can I go through a hard time and come out the other side okay or not? Yeah. Because if I can't, my body, as you've been talking about so articulately, will send signals constantly of, am I okay? Can I go through this hard time? Is my world okay, or am I screwed? Should I be terrified? Should I be in fear? And so a lot of us learn to live, unfortunately, in this place of anxiousness simply because we didn't get the foundation or learn the basic principles of, I can go through a hard time and be okay because there's other people supporting me. So what's your thoughts on that piece?
Millions. I think what happens when we get that, buck up, don't be a little bitch, is we lose faith in the world. We lose faith that, like, when we're children, we're 6, 7, 8 years old, we have kind of this blind faith that the world is going to look after us. And then when we have trauma that's not resolved, we lose that faith. And then what happens is we become like an alpha children, and men are typically like this. It's like, okay, everything is up to me now. Everything is up to me. So if everything is up to you and you can't have faith in anyone else, you're going to live a pretty tough life, because there are going to be times where you just can't cope, or you just can't deal with what's going on. And regaining a sense of faith in the world is so important in your own healing, because if you don't accept help and you're an alpha child, and the thing about alpha children is we do it does work. It does have the illusion of working. If you're intelligent, like I was intelligent, so I went and I became a medical doctor. So I sublimated that pain into something that works for me. But it only works for so long. And then that particular program that I'm running is not going to help me. So when I'm in a really tough time, it's like, can I just have faith? And this is something I've had to learn over typically the last 5 years, just having faith in other people, that I don't have to do it all myself. And it's really important that you can just develop this sort of sense of, okay, and I can wait. That's the other thing about, uncertainty intolerance. Basically, anxiety is uncertainty intolerance. You can't tolerate uncertainty. You can't sit with it and just say, this is uncertain. And not only just sitting with uncertainty, can I embrace uncertainty? Can I embrace that my relationship is uncertain, that I'm not getting along well with my wife, that we are looking at the potential of divorce? Can I embrace that uncertainty? Because if you can't embrace that uncertainty, it's always going to be your master, right? And not just accept it. People are like, oh, well, you got to accept this. And it's like, yeah. But no, embrace it. Because when you embrace uncertainty, your brain will support you in that. It'll start secreting endogenous opioids from the periaqueductal gray in your brainstem. You'll start secreting dopamine because you feel like, hey, I'm on the right track. And the little analogy that I draw is, say you're at a party or something, you see somebody you're interested in. So if you start walking over there and leaning on the balls of your feet and you're moving forward, your periaqueductal gray will secrete all sorts of opiates, like it's protecting you from, potential rejection or whatever. But you will still do it. And dopamine is like, I'm on the right track. I'm doing this. And it's the whole thing about, let's do this. That's exactly encapsulates the opiates and the dopamine. Like that's what you need to get over that hill. Otherwise, if you go on your heels and you think, oh, she's way out of my league, she rejected a friend of mine, like I'm not, like your brain will also support that. So your brain will also it will start secreting cortisol and epinephrine in there as a stress response. So whatever you decide to do, your brain will support you. If you're going to go for it, your brain will support you. It'll secrete chemicals that support you. If you go back on your heels, literally go back on your heels, your brain will start secreting cortisol and epinephrine, which will reinforce every negative thought that you have. And it will make it seem like those negative thoughts are truly real when they are not. So, getting back to the original thing, the amygdala never forgets. So if you are out there and you hurt yourself and your stepdad comes out and says, don't be a little bitch, that's trauma. Like that, you will have an emotional residue left in your system from that. Now, whether or not you can process that and it's cumulative, if that happens to you, every week for a few years, like that's going to create a huge problem. If it happened once, it's still going to be traumatic. It's still going to change your nervous system, so it's one of those things that the amygdala never forgets, but we can overwrite those programs. But to overwrite those programs, we have to go back and visit them. So as Daniel Siegel says, the brain is an organ that is anticipatory, and it has anticipation. This is his term, anticipation for the past. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but so whatever happened in your past, your brain will anticipate that again. So if you're 45 years old and you cut yourself on the lawnmower and you come up and your wife's she comes out on the thing and says, "Are you okay?" You're going to go back to that time. It's like you're expecting your wife to say, "Buck up, you little bitch," right? Mm-hmm. There's part of your amygdala that will encode that emotionally. It's not conscious. And it's really these deep subcortical structures that house these emotional programs that are very dangerous. And we can't just heal those problems just by talking about them. Like insight is the popcorn of psychotherapy. It'll help you knowing why these things happen. But unless you actually find those old traumas and go back and find the child that experienced that trauma and show them that they're seen, heard, loved, and protected, you're always going to be at the effect of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like we have to heal. A lot of the work that I do with men is healing those moments where you either learned or experienced that you couldn't go through a hard time and come out the other side okay. Either because no one was there, right? You witnessed your parents getting divorced and you felt helpless. You watched a parent be abusive to the other parent, or to you, right, or to a sibling, and there was no one there to support you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like we could, thousands and thousands of examples. But But the repair, as you're saying, I love that notion of like insight. What did you say? Insight is the popcorn of
Yeah,
psychology, or
insight is the popcorn of psychotherapy. It comes from a book called A General Theory of Love that was written by 3 psychiatrists. It's a really good book. And that's what they say.
Line.
Like, and coming from psychiatrists, because basically the Western model of psychiatry with psychotherapy is cognitive.
Yes.
They may ask you, okay, well, where do you feel that in your body? But that's as far as they go. Like they don't go any deeper than that. It's like, where do you feel that in your body? And even then, for psychotherapists, that's not even, that's the antithesis of how they were trained. Yeah. So it's all cognitive, So like I said, the cognitive stuff you can only change so much cognitively. It's the language of where these programs are structured is feeling in the body. And that's how you have to change them. So...
Yeah, and we're gonna go, towards the latter part of the show. We're gonna go deep into, how do you deal with anxiety? How do you move through it? Some practical stuff, because I think that's very important. I want to talk first, though, about, do you feel like kids or the younger generation are more anxious than ever before? Because I see a lot of conversation and data out there about how, on the one hand, I think it's a little... ambivalent, where it's like, oh, the younger generation is so soft, and on the other hand, you see research of just the spiking rates of anxiety within our youth. And so I'm curious to see, if you think that that's true, how come?
I think that there's just an energy that we have now that we didn't have back in the 60s and 70s or 80s. There's just the parents, or the environment is more separate. COVID certainly didn't help it. I mean, Dr. Neufeld says all anxiety is separation anxiety. And I believe that. And I believe ultimately, and add on to that, it's like, and it's separation from yourself. So I think the parents are more stressed. Like, I get parents virtually every day on Instagram saying, can you talk to my 15-year-old son? Can you talk to my 14-year-old daughter? It's like, well, I'll work with you first, because they're probably reading that energy from you. So that's the first thing. The second thing
I'm sure they love that.
Oh yeah. No, but you know what? I get messages when I do work with them. I get messages from them like 3-6 months later saying, you know what, my son is so much better now. It's like, yeah, and we didn't do any work with their son at all. Yeah. It's like Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. He works with the owners. He doesn't work with the dogs, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really understanding that there's this play. I think that they're coming into a world energetically, and like sometimes my medical neuroscientist side wants to have a seizure when I talk about the energy of the world. But I think there's an energy now, and I think also the kids are just more stressed. And the other thing about that is we have this thing called the social engagement system in our minds and bodies. And it's eye contact, tone of voice, prosody of voice, body language, and facial expression. So this is how we interact with people. And this is what we mature when we're younger. So if we're playing hockey, or when someone scores a goal, we see that they're elated. We see in their face that they're elated. Or, we lose a huge championship and everybody's like down and, in the locker room, and it's just a bad place to be. But our brains are taking all that in as emotional fodder, as information. Now that builds and matures this social engagement system in our brains and our bodies. So when we need to soothe ourselves or we need to soothe someone else, we draw on that social engagement system that we learned. Now, if we aren't getting this in our kids, if our kids aren't learning that they're not getting enough face-to-face, they're not getting enough emotional face-to-face connection. And this is why the screens are so toxic now, because we can't mature our social engagement system through a screen. It has to be in person. So I think that's one of the other reasons. The last thing is that there's no boredom anymore. Like, boredom is the birthplace of creativity. So when you were bored, when we were young, and there wasn't Instagram, there wasn't a smartphone, you had to frickin' deal with it, right? And you had to go and find something to do. But now there's no boredom, so there's no creativity. So we're getting into this place where whenever someone feels bad, a child feels bad, if they have access to an iPad, they just go to the iPad. So you never actually get to learn how to metabolize negative emotion, because you're always putting a Band-Aid on it as soon as it arises. So that's why I think we're getting this thing like, well, the younger generation is soft. And in a way, they kind of are, because they've never really had to deal with boredom. They never had to deal with negative emotion, because as soon as they get into negative emotion, say they're rejected by a friend or whatever, they just distract them into the screens. So we never really get, it's like trying to play ice hockey and you don't know how to skate. Like you just, you just can't do it. Like it's just, you're going to, it's going to be really, really difficult for you. So I think those are the three main reasons why our kids are experiencing, really high levels of anxiety. I think we're in a more anxious world for sure. The parents are feeling it. The screens are taking away our connection time, and we're not maturing our social engagement system, and we're just not creating people that are resilient, because they never learned how to deal with negative emotion, because they just, every time they get negative emotion, they go into their phone.
It is, and I think what you're saying is, I think everybody can agree with for the most part, because they probably do it themselves.
Oh yeah,
it's just like when you're getting a conflict with your partner. The average person is going to utilize the distractions that culture is providing us, that society is providing us, and they are abundant, right? There are more distractions. Distractions are just a different version of a pill that you can take in the moment, right? Checking your social media when you're in conflict with a partner is a kind of like digital pill that you can take to maybe feel better by simply avoiding the thing that you're feeling in that moment, right? It's a wonderful, wonderful distraction. But like you're saying, I do think that it's incredibly detrimental for the younger generations. And it's something that my wife and I have talked extensively about with raising our son. Because I remember when I worked at the Apple store before I started Man Talks, I was, at one point I was working in the store, and then I, moved up the chain and became a district leader. But when I was working in the store, I'll never forget the amount of parents that would push the little carts, what do you call them? The strollers. You think I should know this. I have a child.
Yeah, you have
would push the strollers into the store with like a 2-year-old holding an iPad, playing on the iPad.
Sure.
And they'd be so proud, like, oh, look how great my kid is with the iPad. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like play that out, when that kid's at dinner, when that kid's just using the iPad all the time, and they don't have to have social interaction all of a sudden, and the detriment that can have on that child's capacity to develop social skills, social cognition, social intelligence. It's like, and then the robustness, because sometimes being in a social environment is hard. There's rejection, that you can feel people, you can see their emotions, in their eyes, in their body language. Your body feels what they're feeling quite often, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, you're tuned into it. And so that can be quite taxing. And so I just think it's a very interesting time. From your perspective, we're going to just pause on this one for one more question. I want to keep going. What do we do? What do we do to support our children, to support the future generations, knowing that the problem is likely to get worse, aka AI?
Right.
The problem is likely to get worse than it is to get better. How do we deal with this?
More FaceTime, and more physical touch. Like
Not Apple FaceTime.
Not Apple FaceTime. Yeah, exactly.
They even hijacked that, right? They got you.
Right. It's got right into the language already. Yeah, emotional connection, physical connection, face to face. Like one of the things that I sort of suggest for my parents of young kids is, play a game around the dinner table. Like what's my face doing? Like, am I happy? Am I sad? Am I frustrated? Like what's going on with my face? Because, there's a place in our brain that's specifically designed to focus on faces. And if you have a stroke in that area, you don't recognize faces anymore. It's called propopagnosia. So it's one of those things that we are specifically designed to look at faces. And if we don't have enough face-to-face contact, I do believe that it creates a sense of alarm in our system. We are, cultural, social creatures. We need this. But the thing is that dopamine-driven, immediate gratification brain, more, it's very seductive. So if you have a chance to sort of, stare into the eyes of your partner or go on this new video game you just bought, chances are you're going to lean towards the video game, because the serotonin doesn't have the same pull, and this is a gross generalization, but serotonin is kind of like the present moment chemical. Like when you're watching a sunset, it's like, this is amazing. I'm just loving being here. I'm loving the taste of, a sip of wine or whatever. You're in that moment. That's serotonin. But it's like anything extra personal, anything outside of your reach is dopamine. And it's so seductive. And talking about kids, if you look at frame rate changes, like scene rate changes, if you look at the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner commercial or the cartoons of the 1970s and 80s, there would be about 7 to 8 seconds where the coyote would be walking along a path. Now, if you look at the cartoons that the kids watch, it changes every 1.5 to 2 seconds. Like the frame rate, the scene rate changes. So what we're doing is we're teaching kids, it's like, don't pay attention to this thing because another thing is going to come along that's way better than this, right? And I think that's true. Like sometimes I'll even notice that, like I'll be on social media, like scrolling Instagram, zombie scrolling Instagram, which is one of my little, kind of dissociative practices. And I'll look at a post and I'll go, did I see this post? I don't. And then there's a part. Oh yeah, okay. So you don't encode the post, like you encode a tiny bit of it, and then you're on to the next one. So we're kind of teaching our brains, and I think this is affecting people's memories. Like people in their, they start getting 40s, 50s, and I'm losing my memory. It's like, well, how often do you zombie scroll Instagram? Well, quite a bit. Well, you're teaching your brain not to pay any attention to the nuances of anything. And then, so that's basically the definition of losing memory. Is like memory is the nuances of the experience, like just getting into it. If you write an exam, you want to know the nuances of whatever the professor is going to ask you. But if you're losing that for the sake of going to the next image, like we're just teaching people, we're teaching our brains, we're conditioning our brains to not pay attention to the present moment. And dopamine is ruling our lives. And it's The Molecule of More, which is an excellent book as well, just about how we're driven by dopamine. You talk about that with porn. Like it's basically this, there's no emotional investment, right? It's just automatically there. And it's just so dopamine driven and it always wants more. So there's always, the porn has to get a little different every time, a little time. So it just keeps building on itself. Mm-hmm. And it's such a huge issue. And that's why I think meditation is so important. That's why just sort of connecting emotionally. That's why physical touch is just, even touching yourself, even, like jokes aside, but, even, finding the alarm in your body, which we can maybe talk about in a few minutes, and just putting your hand over that area and just connecting with it. That's serotonin. That allows us to go, okay, I can feel safe. Because one thing about dopamine is we live in our heads, and there's no sense of time in your head. Like the amygdala has no sense of time. There's no sense of time in your head. It's in your body. So if you spend all your time in your head, that's why people say when they get older, it's like, oh, I feel like the last 10 years have raced by. It's like, yeah, because you've lived in your head the whole time. You haven't actually gone into your body and actually felt anything.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting because as you're talking, I remember watching an interview with Mr. Beast, who is he's got the biggest YouTube channel. He's got the most subscribers on YouTube. And the interviewer was asking him about a couple of the tips that made him very successful. And one of the things that he talked about was how they upped the transition rate on their episodes. And so when you watch his, some of his most successful episodes, what you'll notice is that it's transitioning constantly. You're watching this and he's talking and then it's switching to somebody else and they're in a different scene and it's like every 3 or 4 seconds they're switching. It's like, it's very hard for me to watch because I find it sort of jarring and disheveling. And I'm like, this is, almost like disorienting, because it seems like it's using this change of frame and change of transition to almost like mesmerize the audience. And what's fascinating is that I learned all these I heard him talk about all these tactics, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to do any of those things when I put out YouTube content. So I'm just going to put out a 12-minute video of me talking, and whoever listens is going to tune in because I just find that more effective. And I think there is this kind of revolt against some of that stuff that is hijacking our brain. And last thing I'll say is, I remember researching. We really try and not let our son watch any TV. He never uses iPad, never goes near a phone. But every once in a while, we just need 10 minutes of something. And so I've been very conscious of researching all the shows that have that high transition rate that are for kids. And for whatever reason, he has just gotten into 2 things. Number one, watching rally car racing with me. And
Okay.
so usually that has like you watch a rally car and it goes through like 12, 15 seconds and then it'll change and you'll see a new rally car and it'll follow it. And the other one, which I still get a crack at, it still kicks me, but watching planes take off and land. And so if he's going to watch TV, he's like watching real life things happening. He's not watching the cartoons. He's not watching the Blippy or whatever it is, Coco Melon, where the frame rate's just changing constantly and, tripping them out and just getting them out rush. So I would say to all the parents that are out there and just the human beings that are out there, look at how this, impacts your life. In terms of what are you watching, what are you consuming, where there's that constant change happening that's trying to hook you in. So, okay, let's talk about two more things, and then we're going to switch into what do we do? How do we deal with this?
Sure.
So you talk about anxiety not being a feeling. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, anxiety is a thinking. Anxiety is putting words together in a sentence that have emotional significance to you. So, and the example that I'll often use is if when I was practicing, say I had a 15-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl in my office, and I go in and I go, Sarah, you might be pregnant. Now she'll freak out, right? Her body will go into fight or flight, all that kind of stuff. Now, if I go in to the boy and I say, hey, Jake, you might be pregnant, he'll just laugh. Right. There's no emotional significance to that. He doesn't pay any attention to it. But what we do is we create our own worries based on our own fears. As Dan Siegel says, the brain's an anticipation of the past, So we create our own fears, and because we created them, we believe them. And then that just creates this alarm anxiety cycle. And we just get locked in that cycle where the alarm in our body typically from old unresolved wounds, fires up the anxiety in our mind. And the anxiety in our mind fires up the alarm in our body, and we get caught in this cycle. And we don't even realize we're in this cycle. So anxiety is the thinking component of that anxiety alarm cycle. Alarm in the body from the old unresolved wounds is a much bigger player. But as I said before, because we are so, mind oriented, we assume the mind is the root cause of the problem. On top of that, when we start secreting epinephrine and cortisol in our system, we paralyze the prefrontal cortex and premotor areas. So we lose the ability. Not only do we make more threats in our mind, we make up more shit in our minds, but the part of our brain that would kind of rationally look at those things and say, hey, that really isn't a major deal, is shut off. So we get more threats. And then we also in our, the infinite wisdom of our brain, we believe those threats because the part of our brain that would tell us that those threats aren't real is offline. So that's why I mean about sort of getting your body under control, because once your body gets under control, then your prefrontal cortex comes back, then you can see things clearly. And the example that I often use is like, have you ever been freaked out about something and the next day go, why did I get so upset about that? Chances are the state of your body was in a deep state of alarm. So you paralyzed your brain. And then we try and use our brain that's paralyzed to solve our problems. But until your body's regulated again, you're not going to be able to have that prefrontal premotor area back to be able to solve the problem in the first place. So it just causes more frustration and pain and more worry. Going back to what you were saying about dissociation and the kids in the frame rate, is that you're creating short-term, relief when you give your kid an iPad, but you're creating this kid who's now wants that iPad over and over and over again, and it will make your life miserable. So it's just like that's what anxiety does to us. It basically gives us our own worst fears. And then we paralyze the part of our brain that would tell us that that's not real. So we believe our own worst fears. And as Dr. Phil says, how's that working for you? Like, that's not going to turn out well.
I love that example. And I almost feel the need to just say to the parents that are out there, I am not shaming you for giving your kids iPads at all. Like how you want to parent is how you want to parent. I think it's just alarming for me sometimes when I see the overusage of that. So can you just come back to this notion of the alarm? I know you talk a lot about this in the book. You have this beautiful acronym. Can you just talk about, because I think for a lot of people, they feel anxiety kind of as an alarm, right? It's like, okay, I feel anxious, and that's almost like an alarm bell going off saying like, I need to be aware of something, or I need to protect myself from something. And so can you just go into that?
Yeah, well, that's what I tell people is like you're when you're anxious, quote unquote anxious, and I don't really like the term anxious because it doesn't really have a lot of consciousness to it. You can go out with someone and say I'm feeling really anxious, and they won't have a clue of what you're talking about. But if you say I'm feeling really alarmed today, everybody's been alarmed, so you kind of know like everybody's been alarmed, so you can kind of relate to that in a way. So it's really understanding that it's the alarm in your body that's probably stuffed down there from years and years ago. That's the nidus, that's the focus, and that's what's cueing your brain to have all these negative thoughts. And we attribute the thoughts to the problem when the thoughts aren't really the problem. So it's really, can you regulate this place in your body? And you can do it in the short term with like breathing exercises and putting your hand over it and that kind of thing. But really, it's the alarm is your younger self. Like that's the issue. The alarm is your younger self asking for your attention. And sometimes I get people and I'll say, look, that alarm is like a child in a grocery store with his hands, like holding up to you, like pick me up. And you're like, well, I'm an adult now. I was bullied as a child. You were bullied. I don't really want to deal with you. So I'm just going to push that away. And of course, the child is just going to get louder and louder and louder. The alarm is just going to get louder and louder and louder and create more worries in your mind. And unless you deal with the root cause. And the little analogy that I like using is like you're in a rowboat, it's got a hole in a hull and it's filling up with water. And you can use cognitive strategies and breath techniques and that kind of stuff to bail water out of it. As the water level drops, you'll feel a little better. But unless you go under and actually patch that hole in the hull, unless you go in, find that child, find that alarm, see them, hear them, love them, protect them, show them that they're okay. Don't be afraid to go back into your old pain. You got to feel it to heal it kind of thing. Then you can start metabolizing this thing at its root cause, as opposed to just bailing water by going to therapy every week. And some people will go to therapy because it kind of, it gives them the excuse that they're doing something, right? But they're, insight is the popcorn of psychotherapy. Like I have people that come and see me who have had anxiety for years, and they say, I've been in therapy once a week for 20 years and I'm not a whole lot better. And I say to them, well, if you had a leak in your house and you had a plumber come by every single week and that guy charged you $200 a week and 20 years later that leak was still going, would you keep paying that guy?
Yeah, stop paying that damn plumber.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, so try something new is basically all I'm saying is like read the book, take the program, whatever, like try something new, because the premise that you're operating on, the anxiety comes from your mind, is not accurate. It's reflected by your mind for sure. Absolutely. No question. Like your mind plays a huge role in anxiety, but your mind is not the source of the anxiety. It's the old trauma that's stored in your body. And I know that sounds kind of woo and whatever, but it's just, I get messages from people every day saying, this is the first time someone's explained anxiety in a way that really makes sense to me. Because every book out there is basically change your thoughts. You're thinking negatively. You got to think more positive. And of course, that will help for about 1.6 seconds until you have your next positive thought. But it's so hard to keep thinking in opposition to how your body feels. If your body's holding this stuff that's got to come out, it'll come out in depression, anxiety, eating disorders, OCD, all this stuff, alcoholism. It's got to come out somewhere. So if you go with the root cause, if you find this child in you that, went up to their stepdad and they said, stop crying, you little bitch. Like if you don't go back and find that kid and show them that, like, look, I'll look after you. Mm-hmm. And again, it's like that loss of faith. We lose faith. And when we lose faith, especially as men, women too, but we just start thinking that everything is up to us. And then we can't deal with it because we're not equipped to deal with it. And it's just overwhelming. So we have to find some sort of addiction to sidetrack, because we just don't have the emotional vocabulary and the emotional intelligence to be able to deal with it if you think that you can handle everything yourself. And that's a very big male trait. And it's a very big reason why men kill themselves, is because there is no way out if you adopt that.
Yeah, I remember hearing somebody say that suicide is the ultimate form of self-destruction. Mm-hmm. And oh man, I can't remember. His name is escaping me right now. I quote him in the book. He wrote Infinite Jest. David Foster Wallace. There we go. David Foster Wallace, yeah. who actually took his own life. Mm-hmm. And he described suicide as he has this brutal yet profound quote where he talks about, which is, pretty much like David Foster Wallace in a nutshell, right? Just like brutal and profound. But he says, the real reason why people end up taking their own lives is because they can't escape the thoughts in their own head, the voice in their own head, which is why so many men, and this is obviously, this is going to be, hard for some people to hear, but he says this is why so many men shoot themselves in the head, is to actually stop the voice that is going on. Yeah. And I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think that in our modern culture, and specifically within psychology and therapy, there often is so much emphasis put, and in the self-development and personal development industry, there's so much emphasis on changing thoughts, on altering mind frame, on altering mindset, and focusing in on the thing that is more about the symptom than the actual root cause. And I remember reading Stephen Porges and polyvagal theory, and he talked about how there's, in the polyvagal nerve, there's 80% of the wiring is up into the brain and 20% of the wiring is down into the body. Absolutely. And so you're like, wait a second, if there's 80% of the information is traveling up from the body into the brain, doesn't that mean that there's a tremendous amount of information that's going to the brain from the body versus the other way around? And so I think that was kind of a revolutionary discovery in some way, because I think for a long time within the health industry, within the psychological industry, we had the perspective that the brain just controlled the body, right? That the body just listened to the brain, versus like, oh, maybe the brain actually is taking this substantial amount of input from the body. And so when we're dealing with anxiety, it's less about these ruminating thoughts that we're trying to escape from, and it's more about what's actually happening for me at a somatic level. So what do you tell people? How do you support people when they're saying, when I feel anxious, what do I do? Where should I even begin? Because I think what you're saying is true, but it's big, right? It's like, that's your younger self. So how do we deal with, in the moment, somebody's got anxiety, they're just struggling, where do they start?
Yeah, I mean, there's short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So short-term stuff is, Huberman talks about this, and Huberman, like moving your eyes back and forth. I mean, this is the basis of EMDR as well. It does have a moderating effect on the amygdala. Breathing, just your breath, just that whole physiological sigh thing. 2 snorts in, quick snorts in, then a long exhale. It starts to tell your body that you're relaxed. So if you can relax your body, your mind will just follow that. But it's much more effective to use your body to calm your mind than it is to try and use your mind to calm your body. Like saying, just relax, slow down, you're okay. Like that doesn't do it. So self-touch is one of those things that I have found in my practice and in my own life, just incredibly helpful. And if you look at Pascal, the actor Pascal, you see him like on the red carpet, he's got his hand over his solar plexus and he talks about his anxiety. Like that's what he's doing. He's connecting essentially, when I look at that, he's connecting to the little boy in him. That's basically what he's doing. He's saying, this is a stressful environment, whatever, we'll be okay. Because your adult is fine. It's the child in you that's creating a lot of this issue. So what do children respond to? They respond to music. They respond to vibration. They respond to touch. They respond to something in the moment. And one of my favorite mantras that I say to myself is sensation without explanation. So when you're feeling anxious, go into your body. And it's probably going to hurt. You're probably going to find a place in your throat or your chest or your solar plexus or your gut that has a lot of old pain in it. But put your hand over that. And just that's the first step in kind of connecting. Now, again, that's more of a long-term thing, but it will work in the short term as well. So breath work, moving your eyes back and forth. These, tapping has some, and the reason I don't know if tapping has this magical thing, but basically, if you look at the way the brain is structured, your brain has most somatosensory real estate for your hands and your face. So if you start tapping your hands and your face together, your brain can't ignore that. It has to bring you into present moment sensation. And if you look at worry, it's always about the future. Worry is always about the future. So the more you can bring yourself into present moment sensation, the better you're off you're going to be. And this is the tip my daughter loves the most out of it, because my daughter has a bit of anxiety, not nearly as much as I did, but she said, Dad, the thing that you've said to me that's created the most, peace in me is just saying to myself, am I safe in this moment? So it's really, and it sounds cliche, but middle of the day, middle of the night, when you wake up in the middle of the night in a panic, you're not rational. All your coping strategies that you've used, especially men, are now gone, right? So you're face on with whatever is stressing you out, because you're not able to stuff it down anymore because you've been unconscious for the last 3 or 4 hours. So it's basically just sort of getting into the habit of putting your hand over your chest and just going, hey, I know I'm worried about this. I know I'm worried about my relationship. I know I'm worried about that. But in this moment that I'm in right now, am I safe? And this works in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night. And just because those of us who have these hypersensitive nervous systems, and you may not show up with anxiety. It may show up as OCD. It may show up as an eating disorder. It may show up as depression. But it's like with that hyperactive nervous system, if you can calm that nervous system down enough to be able to just say this rationally to yourself, sensation without explanation, I can sit with it, even though it hurts. Because when I sit with this pain in my chest, that is my younger self, that is the alarm, I'm learning how to metabolize it. But if every time I feel this pain in my chest, I just go up into my head and worry, you never actually deal with the problem. It's just like the kids with the phone. Whenever you feel negative, you just go to the phone. So whenever we feel anxious, we just go into our heads, which is basically the same thing. So it's learning how to use self-touch, breath, coming into the moment, starting to see that, hey, maybe this is a younger version of me. Maybe I can sort of find this. So what I'll do with people, and I'll give you a very short version of this, is, say I have a guy who came around the corner on his bike and he saw the real estate sign on his front lawn, and he knew that meant his parents were getting divorced. So even to this day, when he sees that same real estate company, aside from that, it still charges him up a little bit. So I say to him, okay, where is that in your body? He says, well, it's kind of in my chest area. Okay, is it superficial? Is it deep? It's kind of in the middle. It's not superficial, but it's not deep. Is it a pressure or is it a pain? It's kind of like an ache. It's like a dull ache. Does it have a color? Does it have a temperature? Yeah, it's kind of red and it's kind of hot. Like I said, I'm shortening this down quite a bit. A lot of times people won't have a color, they won't have a temperature, that kind of thing. But it's just basically getting people in and just really getting the nuances of that alarm and really finding it. I have some people, it's hollow. It feels like a toothache. It feels like when I hurt my toe when I was 4. Like, this is what this pain feels like. Like, really drill into it, because there is this part of our brain called the insula, the insular cortex. And the insular cortex is kind of like the top down, bottom up weigh station. So what's coming up from your body is weighed by the insula. What comes from your mind is also weighed by the insula as well. And I believe that the insula, when we have those experiences like, shape up, you little bitch, or whatever, I believe that feeling in your body gets translated to the insula, and the insula creates this emotional signature in your body. And whenever you face that same kind of thing again in your adulthood, that emotional signature gets locked into your body as well. And you feel exactly the same way when you're 7 now. And then the thoughts will come that are completely consistent with that as well. So if you can find that place in your body, and that's what we do, is we find it. It's like, okay, can you put your hand on it? Can you close your eyes? Can you see the child's eyes? Can you see your eyes when you're 7? I have this thing on my phone, which is basically me when I'm 3. I don't know if it'll come up. I hope that, yeah, that's me when I'm 3 years old, right? So that's the thing on my phone. So I check in with him every day. Now, it sounds kind of, like woo and all that kind of stuff, but it fucking works. Like, it really does. Like, I was in therapy for 35 years, and I did EMDR, I did, ACT, CBT, LMNOP, I did everything. And nothing really made a difference until there's 2 types of therapies that really helped me: internal family systems and somatic experiencing. And I also did psychedelics, but psychedelics actually put me back a little bit. I think that they gave me the intellectual stuff that I needed to develop my theories and that kind of stuff, but emotionally, I wasn't quite right for 2 years after ayahuasca. So, not a panacea. I think the way we're going to go with therapy in the next few years is psychedelics, internal family systems, and somatic experiencing. I think that's the way we're going to go with therapy. But but I think people in this dopamine-driven immediate gratification society believe that if I just do ayahuasca or if I just microdose psilocybin, that my problems are going to go away. And it's just doesn't work that way. You really have to do the work and find that child. And sometimes your stresses are so big, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, then you need some help. Like, admit that you need some help and go and get some help, because you won't deal with this on your own. You will not be able to process this on your own. Anyway, that was a long rant. Sorry about that.
No, it's good. It's good. I just on the last piece there, I think a lot of what you've been sort of saying and driving home with people is that anxiety, while you might be feeling it in the moment, the causality is almost always somewhere in the past.
Yeah.
And that it's trying to get us to pay attention to either a feeling that needs to emerge that is past oriented, or or is about the future, right? The feeling is like, oh well, what if this happens again, or et cetera, et cetera, and and that we need to get into touch with what we're experiencing somatically within the body, and that when we can do that, we have a higher chance of understanding what's actually going on and being able to move through it. And finally, the really big piece is that it's relational. That oftentimes the people that I've seen and worked with that have anxiety, it becomes the disconnector. It becomes the thing that makes them feel like they are alone. And as you've been talking about how these sort of past-based experiences, right, your younger self, your inner child, have gone through these experiences of, in the language that I would use, going through a hard time and not being okay, that in those moments where you're feeling anxiety, what you need is a reminder that you can go through that hard time feeling anxious with somebody else there, or, in conversation with you, and be okay. And that sometimes we also need that with ourselves, right? I almost hear you talking about the younger self as like, we need to remind that younger version of ourselves that's showing up, that's saying like, I don't know if I'm going to be okay if I ask that woman out, if I fail at this conversation, if the deal falls through, or I can't pay rent, or like whatever it is that we conceptually think is causing the like deep anxiety. So I really appreciate that. Is there a difference between anxiety and stress? Like within the brain, are they relatively similar? Is the jury still out on that?
Yeah, I mean it's really hard because we have functional MRI scans, and that's it. But even functional MRI scans are like 10 to 15 seconds behind, and the amygdala acts within 0.4 of a second. So we're kind of drawing interpretations from fMRI scans and stuff. So our imaging is amazing, but it's still in the moment kind of falls short a little bit. So I think it's really about, how do we understand overwhelm? And I think what anxiety is basically our own thoughts start. It's like Siren Island, Ulysses so he's on his boat, and he's with his sailors, and they get him to strap him to the mast. Because they know when they go by Siren Island, there's all these beautiful women with these beautiful songs, and what happens is the men steer their boat onto the rocks, and then the beautiful sirens turn into horrible monsters and kill them. So I say that the thoughts are kind of like the sirens. They're very seductive. Like that, your brain is telling you, we can think our way out of this, because as children, that's all we had. If you're a powerless and helpless child, all you have is to go into your head and kind of, make up an imaginary story or whatever. So it becomes a habit. So we go into our heads as a way of soothing ourselves, which works when we're a child. But as we get older, we don't realize that we're adult now. We don't actually have to add thoughts to the feeling. We can just sit with the feeling itself. And like I said, if it's, horrendous, like get some help. But we can learn how to soothe ourselves. We can learn how to heal ourselves. And in that, especially with anxiety, because anxiety has a lot to do with just being out of control, as you're saying. So if you start learning and teaching yourself, hey, you know what? We went out of control, but now I'm connecting with my younger version of myself. I'm connecting, with my body. I learned like, oh, I can actually handle this. I can actually deal with this. I don't have to go into my head. Because that's one of the biggest tips that I tell people. Like, people say, well, what's the one thing that you could tell people that'll make a huge difference in their anxiety? It's like, feel it in your body, but don't add thoughts to it. And just because your mind is going to, over here, it's going to be like, hey, we can think our way out of this. We can think our way out of this. Just keep thinking. It's like, no, that's a trap. Basically, all you're going to do is just drill yourself into more anxiety. So really, it's about just sort of finding the source of it in your alarm and just being able to tolerate that sensation. And I think, Bessel van der Kolk talks about that, and the body keeps the score. It's like, we're not teaching people how to get rid of their anxiety. We're teaching them how to acclimatize to the sensation, basically, of alarm. Alarm's kind of my term. We're teaching them so that they don't freak out every time this alarm comes up and have to go into their head and worry, because it's this alarm anxiety cycle. So if we can break that cycle, if we can just break it apart where we can allow the alarm to be there without compulsively adding thoughts to it, then we start metabolizing it. Now, that can be, if you've had pretty severe trauma, that can be very difficult. So that's when you need some help. But basically, that's how you heal, is you separate the alarm in your body from these, horrible warnings, what ifs, worst case scenarios that your mind creates. Same with depression, and same with shooting yourself in the head. It's like stopping that internal voice that probably started when you were very young. Because I wanted to sort of put this in there as so what I believe, the short version of what I believe is, when you were younger, you experienced a trauma that was too much for your little mind to bear. You stuffed it down into the unconscious, right? Freud would call it repression or suppression. And then as the body keeps the score, the body is a representation of the unconscious mind. It finds a home in your body, long-term storage. Now, what we're doing is we're going back and we're finding that alarm that's in your body so that we can reverse engineer your healing, so that we can go through the unconscious. We can allow ourselves to feel those same things, process them now in a way we couldn't back then. And then we bring it into our conscious mind like, oh yeah, I used to be like that. I used to have, that was a problem for me. So that's basically how we reverse engineering healing through a somatic perspective.
I love it. I love it. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we're almost up for our time today. Two things that we'll wrap with. Number one, is there anything that you want people to know about anxiety that we didn't talk about? And then for people who are wanting to check out your book, check out your program, where can they go?
Yeah. Well, as far as anxiety, just realize that, we kind of do it to ourselves. And it's not to be self-blaming or whatever. It's just realizing that you have more control over your thoughts, but you can't actually control your thoughts directly. You have to go through your body first, get your prefrontal cortex back, get your premotor cortex back, then you can deal with it. So don't try and deal with your anxiety while your body is in an activated state. You just don't have it. We did touch on that, but it's such an important point. And as far as, people getting a hold of me, at the Anxiety MD, not the anxiety doctor, but at the Anxiety MD. The Anxiety MD is my website. It's, if you Google the Anxiety MD, I'm easy to find. My book is called Anxiety RX. My program is called Your Mind Body Prescription for Permanent Anxiety Healing. It's affordable. I have a little issue with the business of trauma, like asking people to pay $3,000 or $4,000 for, helping them with their trauma. I have an issue with that. So it's $100. It's not $97. It's two payments of $50 if you want to break it up over a couple of months. And I just want to get my work out there as much as I can, because I think that the current traditional model of anxiety is not accurate. And I think a lot of people are paying a lot of money in therapy, and it's not really helping them. It's helping them cope, but to really heal, you've got to go back. You got to feel it to heal it. You got to go back and find that child and show them they're seen, heard, loved, and protected. That's really as ethereal and woo as that sounds. After 35 years, that's the only thing that made a difference for me.
Love it. Nailed it. Appreciate it. For everybody that's out there listening, man it forward. Share this conversation with somebody that will enjoy it, that could use it, that could use the information and the conversation that we dug into. And don't forget to subscribe to wherever you are listening to this, whether you're on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Music, wherever you are, don't forget to subscribe. And until next week, this is Connor Beaton signing off.